Hello viewers, welcome to my fifth lesson. In this lesson, we are going to discuss essay writing. That is question 2, question 3A, question 3B, and question 3C. I want to start by saying the emphasis in this question is mastery of the text. In this test, the candidates are expected to read and understand the text and master every detail of the text. So I'm going to take you through the procedure of writing an essay as tested in KCSE. The first thing that the candidate must do is to ensure that they read the text thoroughly before the exam. By so doing, the candidate will ensure that they have adequate mastery of the details. As we continue with this lesson, it will become clear why the candidate must have the details of the text at their fingertips. When we talk about reading the set text thoroughly before the exam, there are two things that the candidate must do. Number one, the candidate must read the text, the word of the text. What do I mean by the word of the text? This simply means what the text says. However, for purposes of preparation for the exam, the candidate should not restrict him or herself to the word of the text. In KCSE, the candidate must go beyond the word. That is what we say, reading between the words and beyond the words. What do I mean by that? When you read between the lines, then you begin to critique what the writer says. As you critique what the writer says, you are also trying to unravel the why of the text, the effect of the text, the outcome of the text, and finally, the value that is espoused in the text. That is a very critical part that will lay the foundation for the candidate to understand the text. Now, having read the text thoroughly before the exam, the second thing that the candidate must do is to read and understand the question. Read and understand the question. When a candidate reads and understands the question, then that means that the candidate understands the task. It becomes very clear in the mind of the candidate what exactly is required of him or her in the examination. The understanding of the question is so critical that a candidate who does not understand the question will definitely not answer the question correctly. The third thing that the candidate must do after reading and understanding the question is to identify and underline the key words. Identify and underline the key words. Now, the reason why a candidate must read and understand the key words in the question, it is because when the points of interpretation of any given question are given, they are derived from the key words of the question. And therefore, a candidate who understands, identifies, and underlines the key words is very clear about what the expectation of the question is. And once you know the expectation in the question, then you can easily give the question a credible interpretation. Let me give an example of a question from Blossoms of the Savannah. This is question 2, Blossoms of the Savannah. And the question says, though rich, the Ma culture has aspects that have outlived their usefulness and need to be shed off. Justify this assertion, drawing illustrations from Blossoms of the Savannah by H.R. Olekulet. My dear viewers, in this question, there are certain words that are critical in the interpretation of the question and the task. The first word that we need to focus on is Ma culture. So here we are saying, or the writer is saying in the question, the Ma culture is rich. And this Ma culture has aspects that have outlived their usefulness. So again, we outline the word aspects. Then after we outline the words aspects, then we have the word outlived. And then we have the word usefulness. And finally, we have the word shed off. And of course, not forgetting that the instructions are justify this assertion. And you are drawing illustrations from Blossoms of the Savannah. It is also important to note that these illustrations are being drawn from Blossoms of the Savannah, not any other text. It is not from rumors. It is not from lesson notes. It is also not from study guides. So once the candidate has identified the key words in this question, then they are now ready to proceed to the next stage, which is using the identified key words, formulate points of interpretation. Now, when we come to formulating the points of interpretation, I have said that these points of interpretation are formulated using the key words. The next step after you have identified the points of interpretation is to arrange those points in order of strength. And what we mean is that all the points relating to the question do not have equal weights. There are those points where we have adequate illustrations from the text. There are those other points where we say that the point is merely mentioned in the text. And because the expectation in every or in any essay, you are supposed to develop about 4 points. And therefore, as you come up with as many points of interpretation as possible, then you need to have 4 strong points that you are going to use to develop the body of your essay. Therefore, that's why I'm saying you arrange the points in order of strength so that when you begin to write the essay, the body of the essay, then you start with the strong points, and then once you are satisfied that you have your 4 points, then you are good to go. And now after you have arranged these points in order of strength, then you move on to the next stage, which is writing the essay. Now, writing the essay is a very critical stage in answering the question. And I want to say 3 things. 1, we say that an essay must start, which is to say, it must have an introduction. Secondly, the essay must develop, which means it must have the body. And finally, an essay must conclude, which means it must have a conclusion. Now, let me start with the introduction. Now, when you are writing an essay, it must have an introduction. And we say the introduction is the first paragraph of the essay. Number 2, it is independent from the rest of the text of the essay. And number 3, it must be an introduction. Let me say that an introduction is the gate, it is the entry of your readers into the essay. It is the gate through which a reader or your teacher or your examiner gets into the essay. 2 things that must be observed when writing the introduction. Number 1, the introduction should not be a definition of the terms used. Many candidates go wrong because instead of introducing or writing an introduction, they go ahead and they start defining the terms that are in the question. And quite often, you find that many candidates give wrong definitions of words used in the question. And therefore, a candidate must proceed to introduce the essay without defining terms. Secondly, the candidate should never use the same words as used in the question. At this point, maybe we could advise that a candidate can use synonyms, that is, words that have similar meaning with the words used in the question. But the candidate should not use those the words used in the question word for word. The candidate should use different words to write their introduction. At the same time, the candidate must ensure that they demonstrate an understanding of the question in the introduction. The introduction must echo the question, because in the introduction, this is where the candidate indicates that they have understood the task that they are going to perform. At the introduction, the candidate will also give a clear indication as to how they intend to approach the question. And therefore, the introduction is very important. I have said it should be the first paragraph. It should be set apart from the rest of the essay, and it must be very clear that you are introducing your essay. There are about 4 ways of introducing an essay. I'm going to have a look at all the 4. The first one is what we call general introduction. When we are talking about general introduction, this is where, having understood the question, the candidate now gives a general impression referring to what happens in the larger society, referring to what happens in the world, referring to what happens in the continent, and so on and so forth. Now, taking you back to our question about the Ma culture being rich and having aspects that have outlived their usefulness. A candidate who says, for example, culture is something that is highly valued, but if its aspects affect people in a negative way, it should be done away with. This is brought out in Blossoms of the Savannah in various ways. Another example, some traditions are not useful and helpful in the society we live in and should be discarded. Up to that point, the candidate demonstrates a very clear understanding of the task ahead. The second way of introducing an essay is using what we call contextualized introduction or specific introduction. And this is where the candidate now refers to the text in question. For example, in the same introduction that I have given, you can decide now to move the next stage and refer to the text by saying, for example, some traditions are not useful and helpful in the society that we live in today and should be discarded. This is brought out in the text, Blossoms of the Savannah, where we find that the Ma people had their culture which was not helpful to them. So in this case, we are saying the candidate is making specific reference to the text. Another example is some cultural practices undermines one's dignity and importance, and they need to be eliminated. This is evident in Blossoms of the Savannah, where most characters undergo pain and agony due to their adherence to cultural practices. So in this case, we have an introduction that is specific and pointing directly to the text, Blossoms of the Savannah. The third way of introducing an essay is combining both general and specific. So the candidate begins general and then moves to specific. That is also a good way of introducing an essay. The third way, or the fourth way of introducing an essay, is to give an outline of the points. What do I mean by that? Earlier on, I talked about formulating points of interpretation for every question. So the candidate can decide to outline the various points that they intend to discuss in their essay. For example, in this question where we are talking about the Ma culture having aspects that have outlived their usefulness and therefore needs to be shed off, a candidate can identify some of these cultural aspects that needs to be shed off. For example, we can talk about FGM, which is one of the cultural practices that needs to be shed off. So the candidate identifies FGM as one of the cultural practices. The second point could be selection of suitors for women, whereby parents are the ones who select suitors for their daughters. We can also talk about male dominance, where women are expected to submit to men, which denies them a right to express themselves. We can also talk about the clan system, where young people are barred from engaging in relationships, especially if they come from the same clan. And then we also have the other point could be preference of the boy child over the girl child. And finally, we can talk about early marriage. These are some of the points of interpretation that we can use for this question. So a candidate can decide to outline the 4 or the 5 points that I have given, that to respond to this question, I will talk about FGM, choice of suitors, male dominance, intra-clan relationships, preference of boy child over the girl child, and early marriage. That can also serve as a good introduction. And finally, a candidate can introduce an essay by paraphrasing the question. And when we're talking about paraphrasing a question, we are referring to writing out the question in their own words. To paraphrase is to write out in your own words. But I need to say here that the paraphrase must be intelligently done. Because if you don't paraphrase correctly, then you risk being considered as duplicating the question. And therefore, in the paraphrase, the candidate must indicate that they understand the demands of the question, and they must not use the exact words as used in the question. As I have said in conclusion, the introduction should be separate from the first point, and I advise that from the introduction, you skip a line so that it becomes very clear that this is an introduction that is distinct. So during our sixth lesson, we will now look at the body of an essay. Thank you very much for listening to me. God bless you.